Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. So go ahead, dim the lights, fluff the pillow, and let the outside world go fuzzy for a while. Because for the next hour and a half, we're going to drift through a quieter, darker corner of history. Not the kind with clanging swords and roaring battles, but the kind whispered about in candlelit corridors. This is the world of suspicious royal deaths, where emperors slip away under mysterious circumstances. Kings catch fatal colds right after angering the wrong noble, and queens seem to fall from towers far too conveniently. History books tend to wrap these stories up in polite euphemisms, like succumbed to illness, died suddenly, passed in his sleep. But behind those tidy phrases often lurks a swamp of palace intrigue, betrayal, and the occasional poisoned goblet. And tonight we're going to wade into that swamp, slowly, gently, one suspicious death at a time. Let's start our slow descent with one of the most famous and still unsolved royal deaths of all time, Edward V of England, one of the so-called princes in the Tower. Edward V and the vanishing heir problem. Edward V's life, if we can even call it that, was short, chaotic, and defined almost entirely by other people's ambitions. Born in 1470 to King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville during the tail end of the Wars of the Roses, that endlessly confusing medieval soap opera where two branches of the same royal family took turns overthrowing each other, little Edward was a golden ticket in human form. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, at the ripe old age of 40, because Tudor-era middle age was about 36, his 12-year-old son technically became king. But of course, 12-year-olds aren't known for their advanced statecraft skills, so the boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was appointed as Lord Protector. That's medieval England speak for babysitter with absolute power. And Richard, well, let's just say he took that role very seriously. Edward and his younger brother Richard, yes, another Richard, medieval England had the creativity of a cardboard box when it came to names, were brought to the Tower of London for their protection, which, historically speaking, is the political equivalent of someone telling you they're going to take you for a walk while holding a shovel.
The boys were seen occasionally at first, peeking from the tower's windows. And then they weren't. Poof. Gone. No official record of their deaths, no bodies, no royal funerals. Just silence. And a suspiciously empty throne. A few weeks later, Uncle Richard declared the boys illegitimate on the basis of a retroactive technicality about their parents' marriage, and crowned himself King Richard III. Because why settle for being Lord Protector when you can just have the whole job? Theories about what happened next range from the obvious, that Richard had them smothered quietly in their sleep, to the convoluted, including one where the Duke of Buckingham did it behind Richard's back, or that Henry Tudor's agents did it to frame Richard later. But no theory ever produced a body, and no one ever stood trial. And centuries later, we're still left with one of England's sleepiest unsolved mysteries. Two boys, a locked tower, and an uncle who just happened to need them gone. Let's drift over to France now, where suspicious royal deaths weren't just common. They were practically a national pastime. And few are more eyebrow-raising than that of Charles VIII, the so-called affable king, who died in a way so absurd it almost feels made up. Charles VIII, death by doorframe. Charles VIII became King of France in 1483 at the age of 13, and his reign was, well, mixed is the polite word. He launched an ambitious campaign to invade Italy, briefly seized Naples, and then lost it almost immediately. Classic medieval king stuff. But none of that is why we're here. On April 7, 1498, Charles was attending a celebration at the Château d'Amboise. There were games, jousts, dancing, the usual medieval attempts to forget that life expectancy was roughly 35. And then, as Charles was walking through a low doorway in the castle, he hit his head. Hard. He shrugged it off at first. Then, hours later, he collapsed and died.
Now, let's slow our pace and drift into even murkier waters, the ones where death itself becomes a political strategy. Because as much as we like to imagine royal murders as rare, scandalous events, the truth is that in many courts, eliminating an inconvenient relative was just Tuesday. Take, for example, the fate of King Edmund II of England, also known with zero irony as Edmund Ironside. Edmund Ironside, a death too convenient. Edmund was king for about 5 minutes in 1016, fighting off Danish invader Canute the Great. The two eventually agreed to split England between them, Edmund keeping the south, Canute the north. It was a compromise that might have stabilized the realm. But just weeks later, Edmund was dead. The official record says he died after a short illness. The unofficial gossip, repeated gleefully by medieval chroniclers who clearly enjoyed their work, claims Edmund was murdered while, shall we say, occupied in the latrine. Allegedly, an assassin hiding beneath the privy stabbed him where the sun doesn't shine. It's impossible to verify, of course, and the story might well be an exaggeration. But what's not in doubt is who benefited. Canute. With Edmund gone, there was no more compromise. He became sole king of England. The moral of the story? Never trust a peace treaty that ends in a shared throne, and maybe check the bathroom before you sit down. Let's pause for a breath here. Because if there's one thing we're already learning from these suspicious royal demises, it's this. The line between natural causes and political convenience was paper thin. Sometimes it was a mysterious disappearance in a tower. Sometimes it was a fatal bump on the head. Sometimes it was torture disguised as divine will. And sometimes it was a knife from below when you least expected it. But one thing was always the same. When a monarch died unexpectedly, someone always stood to gain. And in the next part of our sleepy journey, we'll explore even darker corridors, from emperors who drank themselves to death a little too quickly, to queens whose accidents looked suspiciously like assassinations. All right, still with me? Good. Let's stay in this soft, sleepy lane and keep going deeper into the murk. You're settled in, the lights are low, and we're about to tiptoe into another century of suspicious royal demises, the kind where people slipped, tripped, or unexpectedly stopped breathing right after upsetting the wrong person. And we're going to start with one of the most famous, and frankly, one of the most suspicious poisonings in Roman imperial history. Emperor Claudius, death a la mushroom. Claudius is one of those Roman emperors whose entire life feels like one long misunderstanding. He was never meant to rule, he stammered, he limped, and his own family considered him such a non-threat that they kept him tucked away like an embarrassing heirloom. And then, surprise, everyone else died, and Claudius became emperor in 41 CE. For 13 years, he ruled Rome with surprising competence. He reformed the bureaucracy, expanded the empire, and even conquered Britain, which is basically the ancient Roman equivalent of winning a really long and annoying group project. But Claudius's reign had one rather large problem: his wife, Agrippina the Younger. Agrippina was ambitious, and ambitious in the Roman context means possibly willing to murder half the Senate to get her way. She wanted her son Nero, not Claudius's biological son Britannicus, on the throne. And as you might imagine, Claudius's continued existence was a bit of an obstacle. So, in October of 54 CE, after a pleasant imperial banquet, Claudius suddenly fell ill and died. The official report blamed a fit of apoplexy. The unofficial story, repeated gleefully by ancient historians, was that Agrippina served him a plate of poisoned mushrooms. According to Tacitus, the emperor vomited violently, lingered in agony, and died shortly after. And wouldn't you know it, Nero was declared emperor almost immediately, a transition so smooth and so suspicious it might as well have come with a mission accomplished banner. Agrippina, by the way, was never punished. In fact, Nero's first act as emperor was to heap honors upon her, which, if nothing else, shows a deep appreciation for good teamwork.
Now let's move a few centuries forward to the windswept plains of Hungary, where one queen's death was officially called an accident, though not many people were buying that explanation. Elizabeth of Bohemia. The window was open. Our story here begins with a marriage, because of course it does. In 1370, Elizabeth of Bohemia married Charles III of Naples. It was a standard royal deal: alliances, dowries, mutual resentment. The trouble began when Charles decided that Elizabeth's mother, Queen Elizabeth of Hungary, yes, same name, very helpful, was a political threat. The two queens despised each other, which was fairly standard for medieval Europe, where mother-in-law drama often involved mercenaries. In 1386, Charles invaded Hungary and claimed the crown for himself. He succeeded, briefly, but then he was assassinated by loyalists to Elizabeth's family, and power passed to Elizabeth's young son, Ladislaus. That should have been the end of it, but the political situation remained unstable, and Elizabeth, acting as regent, was captured by her enemies. A few months later, while imprisoned in Novigrad Castle, she fell from a window into the river below. The official report called it an escape attempt gone wrong. The unofficial consensus was that someone helped her attempt that escape by throwing her out. Contemporaries certainly thought so. Chroniclers described her as being pushed rather than falling, and considering that her death neatly eliminated one side of a dynastic feud, the theory that it was all a tragic accident strains credibility. Let's float back westward now, into Tudor England, a dynasty so riddled with suspicious deaths you could make a drinking game out of it. And perhaps none are more eyebrow-raising than the mysterious end of Amy Robsart, wife of Robert Dudley, the favorite and rumored lover of Queen Elizabeth I. Amy Robsart, a broken neck and a broken reputation. Robert Dudley was one of the most powerful men in Elizabethan England. Handsome, ambitious, and most importantly, very close to the Queen, he was widely believed to be the love of Elizabeth I's life. But there was a problem. He was already married. His wife, Amy Robsart, was not exactly a public figure. She mostly lived away from court, and Elizabeth, in a move that was not at all suspicious, refused to meet her. Rumors swirled that if Amy were out of the picture, Dudley and Elizabeth might marry.
Then, on September 8th, 1560, Amy was found dead at the bottom of a staircase with a broken neck. The coroner's inquest declared it an accident, possibly caused by a fall related to a medical condition. But almost no one believed that.
Even Elizabeth's own advisors warned her that marrying Dudley after such a conveniently timed tragedy would destroy her reputation. And it did. The scandal never truly faded, and Dudley's hopes of marrying the Queen evaporated. Historians still debate what happened. Was it an accident? Suicide? Murder orchestrated by Dudley, or even by his enemies, to ruin him? We'll likely never know, but what we do know is that Amy's death changed the course of English history. One broken neck reshaped a monarchy. Time to head north for a moment, all the way to Sweden, and meet a king whose death was so sudden and so suspicious that historians are still arguing about it 230 years later. Gustav III, the Masquerade Murder. Gustav III of Sweden was a classic 18th century enlightened monarch. Loved the arts, promoted science, irritated the nobility. He believed in strengthening royal power at the expense of the aristocracy, which, shockingly, did not make him popular among the aristocracy. On March 16, 1792, Gustav attended a masked ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, Sweden. It was supposed to be an elegant evening of music and intrigue. Instead, it turned into a Shakespearean tragedy. As Gustav entered the ballroom, a group of masked men surrounded him. One of them, Jakob Johan Ankerstrom, pulled out a pistol and shot the king in the back. Gustav did not die immediately. He lingered in agony for 13 days, but the bullet did its job. The conspiracy was quickly uncovered. Several noblemen had plotted the assassination, furious at Gustav's attempts to centralize power. Ankerstrom was executed, the others exiled or imprisoned. The king's death plunged Sweden into crisis, and the monarchy never regained the authority Gustav had tried to build. It was, in a sense, the perfect assassination. One carefully aimed shot that not only killed a man, but also an entire political project. Before we drift onward, let's pause and notice something about these stories. There's a recurring pattern, almost a royal death template.
First, there's the official story, a tragic accident, an unexpected illness, a freak event no one could have seen coming. Then there's the real story, whispered in letters, recorded in diaries, and argued over by historians centuries later. And that real story usually involves someone standing to gain, a rival, a spouse, a noble faction, a son eager for the throne. And if we're being honest, the official explanations are often insultingly unconvincing. A perfectly healthy emperor dies of natural causes at 30. A politically inconvenient queen falls from a window. A royal heir vanishes in a locked tower. At some point, the euphemisms become part of the story, like code words we've all agreed to accept. So let's glide into our next set of suspicious royal exits, ones where the official story is technically possible, but very hard to swallow. In the next part, we'll explore the mysterious deaths of Habsburg heirs, the suspicious suicides of imperial princes, and how one Russian empress might have rewritten history with a single deadly decision. Still awake, or maybe halfway to dreaming? Either way, let's keep drifting. The air's getting heavier here, not just with history, but with the kind of stories where dynasties hinge on a single, unfortunate event. Because if the suspicious royal death we've talked about so far were dramatic, the next ones are downright operatic. They're also, in many cases, even sadder. We're leaving behind the accidental poisonings and the oops I tripped out a window incidents.
Now we're entering the era of heirs who mysteriously took their own lives, or died from melancholy, or simply vanished from the line of succession. And every time, someone, always someone, was there to benefit. Let's begin in Austria, in the twilight days of the Habsburg Empire. Crown Prince Rudolf, a suicide or a setup? Few royal deaths have cast a longer shadow over a dynasty than that of Crown Prince Rudolf, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph and Empress Elisabeth. Yes, that Elisabeth, the famously melancholy empress known as Sisi. Rudolf was born in 1858, and from the moment he took his first breath, the future of the Austro-Hungarian Empire rested on his shoulders, and that future was heavy. Rudolf was intelligent, liberal-minded, and deeply unhappy in a court that valued obedience over ideas. His marriage to Princess Stephanie of Belgium was loveless, his political ambitions were thwarted by his father, and his mental health steadily declined. Then, on January 30th, 1889, disaster struck. Rudolf was found dead at the Meierling hunting lodge, alongside the body of his 17-year-old mistress, Baroness Mary Witzera. The official story was a suicide pact. Rudolf, depressed and desperate, had shot Mary before turning the gun on himself. But almost immediately, the rumors began. Some claimed Rudolf had been assassinated, perhaps by agents of his father, furious over his liberal views. Others whispered that Mary was pregnant, and the court arranged a double death to avoid scandal. Still others suggested Rudolf had been driven mad by arsenic poisoning, administered slowly over time.
The Habsburg court scrambled to contain the damage. They staged a rushed funeral, sanitized the crime scene, and destroyed letters and documents related to the incident. It worked. Mostly. The empire endured, but its future was shaken. With Rudolf gone, the throne passed to Franz Ferdinand, who, as you probably remember, was assassinated in 1914, setting off World War I. So was Meierling a suicide? Maybe. Was it politically convenient? Absolutely. Prince Sado of Korea, death by rice chest. Now let's shift our gaze far from Europe to the Korean Joseon dynasty and one of the most haunting royal deaths in all of East Asian history. Prince Sado, son of King Yangjo, was born in 1335 and raised as the crown prince, destined to rule. But from an early age, he displayed troubling signs: violent outbursts, paranoia, cruelty. He reportedly killed servants in fits of rage and roamed the palace dressed in women's clothes. Some historians believe he suffered from a severe mental illness, though others argue he was simply a product of suffocating royal expectations. By 1762, his behavior had become a national crisis. Ministers feared him, the court despised him, and his father, cold, controlling, and obsessed with order, decided that the dynasty could no longer risk Sado ascending the throne. But executing the crown prince outright would have been unthinkable. So Yangjo chose a subtler solution. On July 4, 1762, Sado was summoned to the palace courtyard. There, a large wooden rice chest, normally used for storing grain, awaited him. Sado was ordered to climb inside. The lid was sealed, and for 8 days he remained trapped inside that box until he died. The official narrative? Voluntary punishment. The reality, a slow, deliberate execution disguised as a family matter. It's one of history's most disturbing royal deaths, a mix of filial piety, political calculation, and raw cruelty. And as always, it served a purpose. With Sado gone, the dynasty could continue, and his son would eventually become one of Korea's most revered kings.
Peter III of Russia, a coup and a convenient death. Let's glide back to Europe now and step into the gilded, paranoid world of 18th century Russia, where mysterious deaths were practically a national tradition. And few were more pivotal than that of Peter III, the hapless husband of Catherine the Great. Peter wasn't exactly czar material. He was immature, unpopular, and far more interested in playing with toy soldiers than ruling the world's largest empire. He also admired Frederick the Great of Prussia, a wildly unpopular opinion in Russia, given that Frederick had just spent years fighting them. Catherine, meanwhile, was everything Peter wasn't: ambitious, intelligent, ruthlessly pragmatic. And in 1762, she decided she'd had enough of watching her husband bumble his way through state affairs. With the support of the military and key nobles, Catherine staged a coup. Peter was arrested and forced to abdicate. Catherine was crowned empress. 6 days later, Peter was dead.
The official statement said he died of hemorrhoidal colic, which, in case you're wondering, is a fancy way of saying, trust us, it was definitely natural. But almost no one believed that. The more widely accepted version is that Peter was strangled by Alexei Orlov, one of Catherine's loyalists, during a confrontation at the Ropsha estate. Catherine, of course, denied any involvement, and maybe she truly didn't order it, maybe she just benefited from it immensely. Either way, her reign, one of the longest and most celebrated in Russian history, began on the corpse of her deposed husband. Prince Albert Victor, the Jack the Ripper rumors. Time for one of the strangest and most persistent conspiracy theories in royal history: the death of Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria and second in line to the British throne. Albert Victor, or Eddie as his family called him, was, by most accounts, a gentle but rather dull young man. He was also constantly at the center of scandal, accused of fathering illegitimate children, rumored to be involved in a homosexual brothel, and, most infamously, whispered about as a possible suspect in the Jack the Ripper murders. He wasn't, but Victorian London loved a good rumor. Then, in January 1892, just weeks after becoming engaged to Princess Mary of Teck, Eddie died suddenly of influenza at the age of 28. On paper, there's nothing suspicious about it. The influenza pandemic of 1891-92 was deadly, and young adults were particularly vulnerable. But that hasn't stopped the conspiracy mill from spinning. Some theorists claim Eddie was quietly removed because of scandals that threatened the monarchy. Others argue he was sent to a remote asylum and his death faked. And a few fringe theories, deeply implausible but still lingering, even insist he was Jack the Ripper and was dealt with to prevent disgrace.
None of these have evidences. And yet, Eddie's premature death left the line of succession open, allowing his younger brother George to become king instead. And George, as King George V, went on to guide Britain through World War I. So once again, a death that was probably natural still changed the course of history. It's worth pausing here for a moment because there's a thread running through all these stories, one that's easy to miss when you're lost in the details. The official cause of death almost never matters. Whether it's a suicide note, a sudden fever, a melancholy accident, or a sealed rice chest, what really matters is who profits. And in royal history, someone always does. Rudolph's death cleared the path to World War I. Sato's death stabilized a dynasty. Peter III's death made Catherine one of the most powerful women in history. And Albert Victor's death paved the way for a more stable British monarchy. History loves to talk about battles and treaties, but it's often these small, mysterious deaths that truly shape the future. And believe it or not, we're still not done. Because the deeper you go into royal history, the stranger and more unsettling these stories become. In the next part, we'll explore some of the most haunting royal disappearances of all, from the lost Romanov children to the bizarre death of a French dauphin who might not have died at all. You're still here. Good. That means you're either deeply invested in this slow-motion royal catastrophe, or you've fallen asleep with the audio still playing. Either way, let's keep drifting. Because in this next stretch of our quiet historical wander, the royal deaths become even stranger. Not because they were suspiciously violent, but because they were suspiciously uncertain.
In some of the most famous cases, we don't even know if they died when history says they did, or how, or where. All we know is that they vanished and left behind a trail of rumors, imposters, and unanswered questions that lasted for centuries. Louis XVII, the boy who maybe died in a cell. If there's one royal disappearance that haunts European history more than any other, it's that of Louis XVII of France, the tragic child king who never ruled. He was born Louis Charles in 1785, the second son of King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette. After his older brother died in childhood, he became the Dauphin, heir to the French throne. But of course, history had other plans. The French Revolution swept away the monarchy, and in 1793, both his parents were executed. The boy, now styled Louis XVII by royalists in exile, was just 8 years old when he was locked away in a dark, filthy cell in the Temple prison. And there he stayed, alone, neglected, and slowly wasting away. The official story says he died on June 8, 1795, at the age of 10. An autopsy described a body ravaged by disease and malnutrition. He was buried anonymously in a mass grave. But almost no one believed that story. Almost immediately, rumors spread that the real Louis had been smuggled out of the prison, perhaps by royalist sympathizers, perhaps by corrupt guards. Dozens of impostors appeared across Europe in the following decades, each claiming to be the lost Dauphin. One even convinced a small following of believers in the United States. The mystery persisted well into the 20th century. It wasn't until 2000 that DNA testing on a preserved heart, supposedly taken from the dead boy during his autopsy, confirmed that he had in fact died in captivity. Still, the story of Louis XVII remains one of the saddest royal deaths in history. A king without a throne, a boy without a childhood, and a life that ended in a cell, leaving a question mark over French history for more than 200 years. The Romanov children. Execution, escape, or legend. From one vanished royal child to an entire royal family. And here, the story is even chilling. The fall of the Romanovs, Russia's last imperial dynasty, is one of history's most dramatic collapses. In March 1917, after centuries of autocratic rule, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated amid revolution. He, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were placed under house arrest.
Then, on the night of July 16, 1918, they were taken to a basement in Yekaterinburg by Bolshevik guards. And there, according to the official account, they were executed, shot and bayoneted, their bodies burned and buried in secret. But if history stopped there, we wouldn't still be talking about it. Almost immediately, rumors began to swirl that some of the Romanovs had survived. The most famous was Anastasia, the youngest daughter, a name that still carries a kind of ghostly resonance. Dozens of women came forward over the decades claiming to be the lost princess, the most famous being Anna Anderson, who fooled even some Romanov relatives. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that the truth began to emerge. Excavations revealed the remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their daughters. Later, in 2007, the remains of Alexei and one of his sisters, likely Maria, were discovered nearby. DNA tests confirmed their identities. The Romanovs had indeed died that night. There were no miraculous escapes, no secret survivors, just a massacre and decades of wishful thinking. Still, the myth of Anastasia and the desperate human need to believe someone survived tells us something profound about how we process royal death. The reality is often too brutal to accept, so we invent stories that make it feel less final. Emperor Constantine XI, death into legend. Some royal disappearances blur the line between history and myth, perhaps none more so than that of Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last Byzantine emperor. When the Ottoman army breached the walls of Constantinople in 1453, Constantine was on the front lines. He discarded his imperial regalia, charged into battle, and was never seen again. The official story is that he was killed fighting, and his body so mutilated that it could not be identified. The Ottomans claimed to have found his corpse, but there was no definitive proof. That uncertainty gave birth to legend. According to Byzantine folklore, Constantine XI never truly died. Instead, he was turned to marble by an angel and hidden beneath the golden gate of the city, waiting to rise again and reclaim his empire. It's obviously a myth, but one that persisted for centuries. Even today, some Greeks refer to Constantine XI as the Marble Emperor, a sleeping king destined to return. This is the other side of mysterious royal deaths. Sometimes they're not about conspiracy or assassination. Sometimes they're about grief and the refusal to let go. The Princes in the Tower, revisited. We touched on the princes in the tower back in part 1, but they deserve another look here, not for how they might have died, but for the possibility that one of them didn't. For centuries, the disappearance of Edward V and his brother Richard has been considered one of history's coldest cold cases. Most historians assume they were killed in 1483, likely on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. But some have speculated otherwise. In the 1990s, a young man named Perkin Warbeck appeared in Europe claiming to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the 2 princes. He was well-educated, well-spoken, and bore a striking resemblance to the royal family. Even some European monarchs believed him. Henry VII eventually captured Warbeck and executed him. Was he a fraud? Almost certainly. But his claim raises an intriguing question. If one man could convincingly pass as a lost prince, could the real one have survived? We'll never know for sure. The bones of 2 children found in the Tower of London in 1674 are widely believed to be those of the princes, but they've never been conclusively identified. Like Louis XIV, their story is half history, half ghost story. King Sebastian of Portugal, the king who refused to die. Our final vanishing monarch tonight is Sebastian I of Portugal, whose disappearance launched not just rumors, but an entire political movement. Sebastian became king in 1557 at the age of 3. He grew into a devout, zealous young monarch, the kind of king who saw crusading as a personality trait. In 1578, he led a disastrous expedition to Morocco, where his army was annihilated at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. Sebastian was last seen riding into battle. His body was never found. Portugal,
left without a direct heir, fell into a succession crisis and was eventually absorbed by Spain. But many Portuguese refused to believe their king was dead. They were certain he would return, leading to a phenomenon known as Sebastianism. For decades, impostors claiming to be Sebastian popped up across Europe. Some were believed, at least briefly. And even centuries later, the phrase "King Sebastian will return" remained part of Portuguese political culture, a symbol of hope and national identity. When you step back and look at these stories, the Dauphin who might have escaped, the Tsar's daughters who might have survived, the marble emperor waiting to rise, they all share something deeper than political intrigue. They show us how powerful the idea of royalty can be. Kings and queens were not just people. They were symbols. And symbols, unlike bodies, don't die easily. Even when the evidence says they're gone, the myths linger. Stubborn, hopeful, sometimes ridiculous, always human. And perhaps that's the real conspiracy behind all these mysterious royal deaths. It's not just about who poisoned whom or who pushed whom out of which window. It's about the way we, centuries later, still can't quite believe that these people, born to rule, destined to shape empires, could die like anyone else. In our final part, we'll bring it all together: the murders, the poisonings, the disappearances, and look at what these stories reveal about power, paranoia, and the price of wearing a crown.